Hello, everybody. Today is another reading of Neal Stephenson's In the Beginning Was the Command Line. And I just want to make a couple comments. We're going to be reading about Linux. He's going to specifically target that today. And so, real quick, for people who may have not followed the previous chapters in this book or just not familiar with tech, if you will, not techie people, Linux is an alternative operating system to like Mac OS and to Windows, right? Which is probably the most popular OS out there. Linux is about 30 years old at this point, based on the old Unix system. And let's put it this way: back in 1999, when this book was written and Linux was new, Linux had a lot of potential. It was quickly developing a fan base, but it was not the most easiest thing to use. You go by the mid 2000s when I learned about Unix, and I learned about things like Ubuntu, which is what's considered a distro or distribution of Linux. It still required you to have some tech skills and stuff to be tech savvy, if you were. Let's move up to the 2000s and 20s. Right now, 2022 to be particular, as I read this book. It has gotten a lot better. It has gotten easier to use. In fact, if you can get flavors of Linux like Mint, which almost looks like a whole desktop system, like similar to Mac, and you can get ones that look like Windows, and they make it very user friendly, and they're lightweight. Most Linux systems I know, if not all, are lighter weight than Windows and even Mac OS. So that's one reason why they're popular with people. And they're also not governed by evil corporates, evil corporations like Windows and Apple. These are often done as we want to call it nonprofit projects in many cases. They are kept alive by just a passionate community, volunteers, and sometimes by donations. So it's one of the things that makes them popular. So with that in mind, with that little rant out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Next chapter: the whole hog of operating systems. Unix has always lurked provocatively in the background of the operating system wars, like the Russian army. Most people know it only by reputation, and its reputation, as the Dilbert cartoon suggests, is mixed. But everyone seems to agree that if it could only get its act together and stop surrendering vast tracts of rich agricultural land and hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war to the un-Russian invaders, it could stomp them and all other opposition flat. It is difficult to explain how Unix has earned this respect without going into mind-smashing technical detail. Perhaps the gist of it can be explained by telling a story about drills. The Whole Hog is a drill made by the Milwaukee Tool Company. If you look in a typical hardware store, you might find smaller Milwaukee drills, but not the Whole Hog, spelled H-O-L-E space H-A-W-G, by the way, which is too powerful and too expensive for homeowners. The Whole Hog does not have the pistol-like design of a cheap homeowner's drill. Sorry for the laugh there. This story is actually kind of funny. But I never blame the Whole Hog. I blame myself. The Whole Hog is dangerous because it does exactly what you tell it to. It is not bound by the physical limitations that are inherent in a cheap drill, and neither is it limited by safety interlocks that might be built into a homeowner's product by a liability-conscious manufacturer. The danger lies not in the machine itself, but in the user's failure to envision the full consequences of the instructions he gives to it. Pre-Whole Hog, I used to examine the drill selection in hardware stores, and what I thought was a judicious eye scorning the smaller low-end models and hefting the big expensive ones, apparently wishing I could afford one of them babies. Now I view them all with such contempt that I don't even consider them to be real drills, merely scaled-up toys designed to exploit the self-delusional tendencies of soft-handed homeowners who want to believe that they have purchased an actual tool. They're plastic casings. Unix is the whole hog of operating systems, and Unix hackers like Doug Barnes and the guy in the Dilbert cartoon and many of the other people who populate Silicon Valley are like contractors' sons who grew up using only whole hogs. They might use Apple, Microsoft OSs to write letters, play video games, or balance their checkbooks, but they cannot simply bring themselves to take these operating systems seriously. Alright, that's the end of the chapter. Now we got some footnotes here, which I'm not going to read because like I always encourage you all, buy the book yourself so you can read all the footnotes and stuff. But let me make a comment before we go to the next chapter. What he says about Unix/Linux is true. Uh, it is a pretty cool system to work with, and I'm spending some time right now setting up my own lab, working on it more. It's great stuff. But let me tell you a piece of history, a story, if you will. So at this point, about 3 years ago, when I started, let's just call it the tech company, the simulation company I started working for, the master control center where we run everything is run by Linux. And the guy, my instructor, my boss, my supervisor, he told me that I was not allowed to touch that for 6 months. Because he says, if you make one mistake, you can ruin everything. You're going to be sitting here rebuilding this host. So, it's really, Linux is not necessarily that bad. You can make a typo or something and, correct it. But it is true. If you don't know what you're doing and you start typing the wrong things, it really can mess up the system. Whereas when you use a GUI like Mac OS or, Mac OS, Windows, it's a lot more forgiving, easier to, like if you make a mistake, like you delete something, you send something to the trash, it's easy to open the trash, pick up the icon representing the file you had, and just put it back into, say, your desktop. Easy peasy. But with Linux, yeah, that's a lot more difficult. So he's telling the truth there. Now let's go to the next chapter. Unix is hard to learn. The process of learning is one of multiple small epiphanies. Typically, you're just on the verge of inventing some necessary tool or utility when you realize that someone else has already invented it and built it in, and this explains some odd file or directory or command that you have noticed but never really understood before. For example, there is a command, a small program, part of the OS called Who Am I, which enables you to ask the computer who it thinks you are. On a Unix machine, you are always logged in under some name, possibly even your own. What files you may work with and what software you may use depends on your identity. When I started out using Linux, I was on a non-networked machine in my basement with only one user account. And so, when I became aware of the Who Am I command, it struck me as ludicrous. But once you are logged in as one person, you can temporarily switch over to a pseudonym in order to access different files. If your machine is on the internet, you can log on to other computers provided you have a username and a password. At that point, the distant machine becomes no different in practice than the one right in front of you. These changes in identity and location can easily become nested inside each other, many layers deep, even if you aren't doing anything nefarious. Once you have forgotten who and where you are, the Who Am I command is indispensable. I use it all the time. The file systems of Unix machines all have the same general structure. On your flimsy operating systems, you can create directories, folders, and give them names like Frodo or My Stuff, and put them pretty much anywhere you like. But under Unix, the highest level, the root of the file system, is always designated with a single character / / that is. And it always contains the same set of top level directories. /user, /etc, /var, /bin, and the book goes on with a lot of other text that doesn't translate well here. Skipping to the next paragraph. Each of these directories typically has its own distinct structure of subdirectories. Note the obsessive use of abbreviations and avoidance of capital letters. This is a system invented by people to whom repetitive stress disorder is what black lung is to miners. Long names get worn down to 3 or 4 letter nubbins, like stones smoothed by a river. This is not the place to try to explain why each of the above directories exists and what is contained in them. At first, it all seems obscure. Worse, it seems deliberately obscure. When I started using Linux, I was accustomed to being able to create directories wherever I wanted and to give them whatever name struck my fancy. Under Unix, you are free to do that, of course. You are free to do anything. But as you gain experience with the system, you come to understand that the directories listed above were created for the best of reasons and that your life will be much easier if you follow along. Within /home, by the way, you have pretty much unlimited freedom. After this kind of thing has happened several hundred or thousand times, the hacker understands why Unix is the way it is and agrees that it wouldn't be the same any other way. It is a sort of acculturation that gives Unix hackers their confidence in the system and the attitude of calm, unshakable, annoying superiority captured in the Dilbert cartoon. Windows 95 and Mac OS are products, contrived by engineers in the service of specific companies. Unix, by contrast, is not so much a product as it is a painstakingly complicated oral history of the hacker subculture. It is our Gilgamesh epic. What made old epics like Gilgamesh so powerful and so long-lived was that there were living bodies of narrative that many people knew by heart and told over and over again, making their own personal embellishments whenever it struck their fancy. The bad embellishments were shouted down, and the good ones picked up by others, polished, improved, and over time incorporated into the story. Likewise, Unix is known, loved, and understood by so many hackers that it can be recreated from scratch whenever someone needs it. This is very difficult to understand for people who are accustomed to thinking of OSs as things that are absolutely have to be created by a company and bought. Many hackers have launched more or less successful re-implementations of the Unix idea. Each one brings in new embellishments. Some of them die out quickly, some are merged with similar, parallel innovations created by different hackers attacking the same problems. Others still are embraced and adopted into the epic. Thus, Unix has slowly accredited around a simple kernel and acquired a kind of complexity and a symmetry that is organic, like the roots of a tree or the branches of a coronary artery. Understand it is more like anatomy than physics. For at least a year prior to my adoption of Linux, I had been hearing about it. Credible, well-informed people kept telling me that a bunch of hackers had gotten together an implementation of Unix that could be downloaded free of charge from the internet. For a long time, I could not bring myself to take the notion seriously. It was like hearing rumors that a group of model rocket enthusiasts had created a completely functional Saturn V by exchanging blueprints on the net and mailing valves and flanges to each other. But it's true. Credit for Linux generally goes to its human namesake, one Linus Torvalds, a Finn who got the whole thing rolling in 1991 when he used some of the GNU tools to write the beginnings of a Unix kernel that could run on PC-compatible hardware. And indeed, Torvalds deserves all the credit he has ever gotten, and a whole lot more. But he could not have made it happen by himself any more than Richard Stallman could have. To write code at all, Torvalds had to have cheap but powerful development tools, and these he got from Stallman's GNU project. And he had to have cheap hardware on which to write that code. Cheap hardware is a much harder thing to arrange than cheap software. A single person, Stallman, can write software and put it up on the net for free. But in order to make hardware, it's necessary to have a whole industrial infrastructure, which is not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. Really, the only way to make hardware cheap is to punch out an incredible number of copies of it so that the unit cost eventually drops. For reasons already explained, Apple had no desire to see the cost of hardware drop. The only reason Torvalds had cheap hardware was Microsoft. Microsoft refused to go into the hardware business, instead on making its software run on hardware that anyone could build, and thereby created the market conditions that allowed hardware prices to plummet. In trying to understand the Linux phenomenon, then we have to look not to a single innovator, but to a sort of bizarre trinity. Linus Torvalds, Richard Stallman, and Bill Gates. Take away any of these three and Linux would not exist. Alright, that's going to be the end of our readings tonight, but before we finish, I just want to make a couple comments. I love how he puts an emphasis on Unix. So, as growing up, I was born in the early 70s, there's the 80s, there's the 90s, never used Unix. Unix was something I discovered in the early 2000s, and that was in computer class. But ironically, though, here's the thing, even by then, Unix was not something that was really popular. We had things like Ubuntu that was coming out. You had all these these flavors and distros of Linux that was coming out, and that's actually what people were using. My buddies were using it. In fact, at this time, if you remember the early 2000s, for those that are around, kind of like how AOL used to give you those CDs in 10 packages. Ubuntu had the same thing. They'd mail you a disc, just flood the market with them, and that's how I got exposure to it. And I also got Linux in the same computer class that taught Unix, would also had a class in Linux. So it's just find it kind of funny how Unix, back in the early 90s, there was Unix, and that was the hackers language or the hackers OS. But you start getting into the 90s and then the later 90s and 2000, you start seeing that shift towards Linux. And even in the professional setting, nobody uses Linux. I'm sorry, Unix. Nobody's using Unix. We all use Linux. Whether, in my case, Red Hat, whether it be Mint for those who want to work at home, whether it be Kali if you're in the security business, whatever, it's all Linux is what the push has been for. But anyway, thank you for listening, and please keep a lookout for the next reading. Our next chapter will be OS Shock. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.